Hello and welcome to this video for the Bicester School History Department. This is a video for students studying AQA GCSE History, specifically the Conflict and Tension in Asia module. Now this will use the Conflict and Tension in Asia Booklet, which is available to download from the school website. The link is in the description. The purpose of this video is to give you some pointers on some key areas, as well as some advice on how to answer some of the questions. Continue to pause this video and work through the booklet. Don't watch it all in one go. If you need any more help, make sure to email your history teacher for any more specifics. Now, last episode, we looked at how President Nixon tried to end the Vietnam War. We also learned about the beginnings of the media coverage of the war. And today we're going to see the impact of the media on the US public. And then we'll look at how the war ended. So firstly, what impact did the media have? Well, some say that the media influenced the mood of the country. We mentioned last time Walter Cronkite, who was considered the most trustworthy man in America. He was a reporter, and so people listened to his opinion. On the other hand, other people say that America was already becoming weary of the Vietnam War, and the media was just reflecting public opinion. Read through the two sources, which show different views of how the media influenced the US public. Now have a go at task 26. For the last question here, make sure to explain using details and facts. During the 1960s, there was a large anti-war protest movement as part of a wide range of protests in the 1960s, some of which we've learnt about in our America module. For example, the Civil Rights Movement and the movement for women's rights. In 1964, Johnson promised to create a great society to improve living standards. However, the Vietnam War was costing lots of money, which meant that he couldn't fulfill his plans. Some protested against the Vietnam War because of this. They felt the American government was spending too much money on it. Also, the American involvement in the Vietnam War also became about race. Many more African American men were being drafted in comparison to white Americans. Approximately 30% of African Americans were drafted instead of just 19% of white Americans. And Muhammad Ali, who was drafted, refused to sign up and was stripped of his title. Many people protested against the Vietnam War because they thought it was racist, and specifically the US government for conscripting and drafting more African American men. Have a go at task 27. Another area of opposition was student protests. Now these were a powerful group of protesters as they didn't want to fight a war that they didn't believe in. They didn't see it as a crusade against communism, but rather a war that involved corruption and confusion. Students began to draft dodge. This meant that they avoided being called up to fight. Often, their protests might turn violent. At Kent State in Ohio in 1970, a particularly key example shocked the world. Panicked National Guard troopers open-fired on protesters, killing 4 and injuring 11. The media in the USA and around the world was shocked that the American National Guard opened fire with live bullets on their citizens. Have a go at task 28. The picture is taken from the Kent State shooting. Then use as much detail as you can for the second question. A final reason and a final straw in the ending for the Vietnam War was the Watergate scandal. Now, this has lots of other consequences and is quite a complicated story, but we need to focus on the impact in Vietnam and the American involvement in the Vietnam War. In this scandal, Nixon, who was president at the time, was implicated in spying on his political enemies. He claimed to have no knowledge of a group of men who placed listening devices, bugs, in the Democrat offices. This is the opposition party. However, it emerged that he probably did have some involvement and that he taped every conversation in his office. It's likely that there was a conversation with the people who did the spying on that tape. He eventually handed over the recordings, but people found that there were parts missing from the recording. Nixon was forced to resign. The American public did not trust him. And all this was going on while the last stages of the Vietnam War were unfolding. Therefore, this made the US people distrust the US president, and by extension, the Vietnam War. Have a go at task 29. And so finally, the end of the war. Between 1969 and 1973, the US held peace talks with North Vietnam. Nixon chose a man called Henry Kissinger, the National Security Advisor for the US, to lead this. As the American public was turning against the war, as seen in the protests earlier, it gave the North Vietnamese the upper hand. They were in a position to be aggressive in the peace treaty. By 1973, North Vietnam, South Vietnam, and the USA signed a peace agreement. The key points were that there would be an immediate ceasefire, a release of all prisoners of war within 60 days, a withdrawal of all US forces and bases, full accounting for missing in action, and self-determination for South Vietnam. This last point meant that South Vietnam could choose who led it. Now, Nixon described this peace treaty as peace with honour. Have a go at task 30. In particular, who gains the most from this peace agreement? However, within 2 years, the peace agreement was meaningless. South Vietnam had fallen to communism, and the capital, Saigon, fell in April 1975. The war was over and communism had won. Have a go at task 31. On the last page of the booklet is a nice summary of how the war ends in Vietnam, but also the consequences, not only on Vietnam, the USA, but around the world as well. Remember, if you have any more specific advice or need any more questions answered, email your history teacher. Thanks for watching.